You're very patient. And what's different about this particular session, well, you'll notice something. The very first session I was preaching, and the second session I was sort of preaching and teaching, and this session I'm sort of leading a seminar. And it's not, I hope, because the spirit is slowly being quenched today, nor that I'm just getting really tired, though I do sometimes quench the spirit. I don't think I'm doing it to you. Each of these topics actually is I'm less certain about. See, for example, you need to preach gospel-centered, Christ-centered, life-changing, on-the-spot, culturally transforming sermons. I take a bullet for that. I'm not going to back off of that. You need to be in cities. Well, we're trying to show that there's a balance here. I would like you to really be concerned about cities as a group, but not necessarily all people feel like they're called to cities. Now, on this last one, I think it's time for you as a network, it's time for all of us as evangelical believers to be smarter about this subject. We need to start talking about it. I am not giving you words from Mount Sinai on this. I'm actually going to give you a few ideas I have about it. And that's the reason why I'm lowering my voice and why and I'm keeping my hands more to my side, because I don't want anyone out there who wonders or disagrees with me to feel that they're resisting God, because you're not. I'm just trying to move you forward, and this is much more of a seminar discussion. It's probably also going to be shorter so that we can have more time for question and answer, which is appropriate to a subject like this. I'd like to talk to you about how the church relates to the culture. And this is increasingly a problem in the Western world, because we have something that the rest of the world doesn't have, and that is we have a post-Christian culture. We have got a culture which is becoming more and more, you might say, anti-Christian, and yet, in other ways, they have some of the benefits of their Christian past. I've just actually bought a book. I haven't started reading it yet, but it's by a sociologist studying Denmark, I think, in Norway, or maybe Denmark and Sweden. And it's called Societies Without God. And the purpose of the book is to show that you don't need God to be a happy and prosperous society. They're saying, look at Denmark and Norway. The number of people who believe in God and who go to church is very, very small, and yet it's an ordered society. They care for their needy. It's a good society, and they say we don't need Christianity. We don't need God at all. But they also have a couple thousand years of emphasis on compassion. You have cultures. Let me give you an example. There's a man named John Somerville. He's just retired as a professor of history at University of Florida, and he's written a book that's actually a great book, Oxford University Press book, called The Decline of the Secular University. It's very, very short and actually a worthwhile read. And because he's a professor of history, he knows something, and that is the Anglo-Saxons that used to live around here really struggled with Christianity, because Christianity believed in forgiveness and compassion for the weak. And Anglo-Saxons said that's ridiculous. That is absolutely ridiculous. And if there's no way that a society filled with Christian belief could even survive, because society is built on respect. People are just going to overrun you unless people respect you. And the basis for social order is respect, and the basis for respect is fear. People have to be afraid. And this idea of forgiving and knowing that you're not going to get, just to know that I could commit a crime and not have my entire family drawn and quartered by the clan that I wronged, that's their idea of justice. The Christian idea of justice and the Christian idea of mercy and compassion was ridiculous, they thought. Absolutely ridiculous. So Northern European paganism, which is what was here before Christianity, was really pretty amazingly bloodthirsty, pretty amazingly power-hungry. And so Christianity comes along and absolutely changes people's attitude toward the weak, people's attitudes toward the poor, people's attitudes toward the marginal. And now, 1,500 years later, you've got society saying we don't need Christianity. We care for the weak, we care for the poor, we're orderly, we believe in the rule of law, and all those things which Christianity brought. And they say they don't need Christianity. They've robbed Christianity culturally of all their goods, and they've thrown God out. And then they're saying, see, you don't need Christianity to. You don't need belief in God to have an orderly society at all. Okay, fine. Let's everybody be Christian for 2,000 years and then throw Christianity out, and then probably maybe it works. Now, what this means is increasingly we've got a new situation. The early Christians came into a real pagan society, and the pagan society was brutal to women. They did infanticide. They enslaved people. It was a brutal society. Christianity comes in, and you can read about this in The Rise of Christianity with Rodney Stark. Wrote a really great book about this. Christianity brought about, had a different attitude toward women, a different attitude toward class and race, a different attitude toward the poor, and it actually, they put the pagans to shame. They created an alternate society inside the pagan society that was so much more, it was a healthy place. People looked in and saw more health, more growth, more joy, more harmony, and slowly but surely, it took 300 years, the Christianity won. And it increasingly became culturally influential, not because it sought power, but because it sought to serve. And it was so absolutely different than the society around it, because it was a human society based on service instead of power. That eventually it grew and grew and grew, and then eventually more and more people became Christians who were magistrates and writers and artisans and so forth, and eventually Christianity really became leaven and salt in the Greco-Roman world. Now, where are we now? First of all, we've got one problem, and that is, for reasons that as an American, I don't want to quite go there. I know it has something to do with World War II. I know it has something to do with state churches. But Europe is almost the only part of the world in which Christianity is not growing very rapidly, as you all know. In many ways, it's a much more secular place. And yet Europe, of course, has been Christian the longest. And therefore, what you've got are secular societies that are living off, you might say, the capital, maybe I should even say the plundered capital of Christian civilization for many years. And yet Christianity has earned perhaps in many ways the scorn of your countrymen, because there has been a great hypocrisy. There has been the established churches to a great degree put emphasis on the rich and the powerful and the edifice and the establishment, and they didn't show care for the poor, and there was just a lot of hypocrisy for various reasons. You're in a situation now where European society is increasingly secular, and yet it's living off the capital of Christianity, but won't admit that it is, and therefore feels like you've got absolutely nothing for them. However, increasingly, I think you're going to find that the old problem of paganism, which was based on the idea of individual power, not service, is creeping back. In spite of the fact that you might say, socialism and liberal secularism has plundered Christianity for an awful lot of its values, nevertheless, at the street level, I think increasingly you're going to find that as Christianity recedes, we have a culture more and more based on power, exploitation, individual fulfillment. And for Christians to create countercultures that based on service rather than individual power and exploitation, eventually will again become very, very distinct, very different. You'll look very much different than what you have in the culture around you. This is all good. In a way, I almost feel that Europe needs to really get non-Christian to be able to get back to considering Christianity again. It's in this odd state in which It's got so many of the, you know the word shards. It has the shards of a broken Christianity. It's got many of the benefits of Christian civilization. It has a lot of the refinements of it, and yet at the same time has lost the heart of it. So I actually find that talking to British people and European people about how do you relate to culture is really difficult and complicated. And I feel like any church like your own, your network, which is growing and you're really getting to be of significant size, you're going to have to start reflecting more and more on how you relate to the non-Christian cultures around you. Let me suggest there are 3 wrong ways to go, and let me give you the most basic outlines to the right way to go, and then we'll talk. The wrong way to go, by the way, a lot of this stuff is actually in the handout, but again, I'm not going to the handout. I'm just giving you. And these 3 things are not there. Right? Let me give you 4 phrases. 3 wrong, 1 I hope right. Defensive against, wrong. Purity from, wrong. Relevant to, wrong. Faithful presence within. Okay. Defensive against, purity from, relevant to, and faithful presence within. Now, all these terms are from a book that hasn't been published yet by a friend of mine who's a Christian sociologist named James Hunter, who teaches at University of Virginia. So that's my acknowledgement to him. But let me tell you what these first 3 are. Defensive against is triumphalism. It is marked by certain people, at least in the United States, that would be called the Christian right. Defensive against is an attitude that largely through politics, we need to take back the culture by essentially taking Christian values, Christian concepts, and making sure the law upholds them. And this is our way of honoring Christ, because there shouldn't be a distinction between private and public. You shouldn't just be a Christian in the private world, you should also be a Christian in the public world, and the way to do that is for Christians to get back into really the corridors of public power, and you should, especially in politics, and we need to get Christian values legislated and out there. That's defensive against. Purity from are people who say Christians shouldn't have anything to do with trying to reform society in any way at all. Now, there's a couple of different versions of this, you know. You have what we call I could call the neo-Anabaptist, which is the idea that Christians ought to form these little countercultures that care about the poor but should have nothing to do to try to salt society. Because if the church, they would say, tries to make society like the church, all that will happen is the church will become like the society. If you try to make the world into the image of the church, you'll only make the church into the image of the world. And there's some historical evidence for this. That's the neo-Anabaptists. They would be in the tradition of the Mennonites and the Church of the Brethren, etc. But you've also got just the old-fashioned conservative evangelical pietism that says our job is to evangelize souls and to disciple people, and we really, as Christians, we shouldn't have anything to do with the world because everything in the world is going to burn up except souls, so let's win souls, and that's it. And that's purity from, let's stay away. Then relevant to. And relevant to is an approach that says, oh my gosh, Christians are so out of it. They're so culturally irrelevant. We need to make sure our music and our message and the way we dress and the places we are really culturally relevant. Now, unfortunately, sometimes that means hip. You know, and rather, you know, I can't be self-righteous. The only reason I'm not into relevant to is I'm too old. You know, Mark Driscoll is in danger of being relevant to. He knows that. He knows all about it. At least that's not one of my temptations. I couldn't even if I tried. But there is a danger with relevant to. Yeah, there's some advantages of getting creaky and old. The relevant to is always been the problem of the part of the church that says we're out of it. We're just out of step. You know, modern scholarship, modern thought. We're out of it. We've got to get updated. And of course, relevant to. Notice I'm being very careful. Some of you are going to probably press me and ask me for examples. And one of the troubles is that whenever you use these kinds of, I think for thinking about this, it's good to have these categories. They're what they call heuristic devices. It helps you think of your world. If you actually think of individual examples, churches and leaders, many of them don't exactly fit into one category. They're largely in this category. So this is my way of looking at what's out there and trying to give you 3 alternatives that I see that I think are all pretty wrong about how the church should relate to culture. Now, the last one is faithful presence within. Look carefully. Look at the word, first of all, presence. There's a difference between being present in the culture and trying to take it over or trying to be absent from it. Presence means this. Presence means we are willing and able to take our people into, we're not keeping them out of the financial world, we're not keeping them out of the art world, we're not keeping them out of the academic world, we're not keeping them out of TV and movies, we're not keeping them out of cities, difficult places to live. We're going to be all those places, we're going to be there, but we're just going to be there and serve. See, instead of saying we're going to take back the culture, what I really would say is, my goodness, make sure that 20 or 30% of your churches, I'm going back to saying, I don't want all the churches in the city, but if you find that you've got 2% of your churches in a big city, put 20 or 30% in the big city and just encourage people to be there and to be in all the parts of the city, to be serving the poor in such a radical way. I mean, this actually happened once. I once heard somebody, a non-Christian, say that church is doing so much for our neighborhood that even though I don't believe what they believe, I'd hate to see them leave because if the church left, we'd probably have to raise taxes. Now, even though that person says, I don't believe what they believe, I'll tell you something. There's a person who, if you're the preacher or you're a pastor, or you're a member of that church and you want to talk to them about the gospel, that guy will give you the time of day. He will listen to you. Why? Because you're present. You're there. You're not just meeting in the neighborhood. You're in the neighborhood. But that also means that you'd have a fair number of Christians in the media, which we don't have. That you'd have a fair number of Christians in the in movie making. You'd have a fair number in the art world, not just in the neighborhoods helping the poor. You just be there. And secularism tends to make people selfish. And religiosity and moralism tends to make people tribal. But if we can show, here we go back to the 3 ways to live, if we can show that what Christianity does is it turns people into servants, fearless servants, people who are not afraid of the city, not afraid of the culture shaping spaces, not afraid of these places, deeply present within, and with a heart to serve. If you seek power rather than service, you'll never get power, nor will you serve. But if you seek service rather than power, people will offer you the power. They'll ask for your opinion. They'll seek they'll give you influence. So you got to be present, rather than taking over or rather being absent. Let me look at another word, and that is within. Rather than creating all of your and Christians do this, instead of creating all parallel Christian institutions, be willing to, as much as possible, get into the schools, get into the institutions with Christians, and support the Christians there. Now, how do you do that? This is where your churches have got to become better and better, and so does my church, at helping people integrate their faith with their work. Let me suggest that this idea of being within is very hard on your... Let me confess something. I was trained to disciple people, but the only way I know how to disciple lay people is by increasingly pulling them out of their world into my church. See, the more discipled they are, the more the more advanced they are in discipleship, the more I'm bringing them out of their world, out of their job, out of their vocation, out of their involvement in the world, and more into my church. And I mean, in the early days of Redeemer, when we would win actors to Christ and businessmen to Christ, they would come and ask me questions like, well, what's the what's the biblical view of short selling? And, first of all, my attitude was exactly what almost all of you are saying, and that is, what's short selling? Of course, in the financial world, what it means is you make a lot of money betting against companies instead of investing in them, betting that things will go bad. And punishing them if things do go bad. Or an actor would come and say, what do you think of method acting? I said, well, what's method acting? Well, see, in method acting, when you have a part that requires you to be angry, you don't act angry, you actually get angry. What do you think of method acting? And I say, well, that doesn't sound good. But that's about as far as, well, he says, is that right for a Christian? And what kind of roles can I take? What kind of stories can I be involved in and tell? I don't know. I want to teach you how to lead a Bible study and eventually become an elder. I want to take you away from all that. Well, does that really fit, with what the Bible says about what God said to Adam and Eve? Go out there and make a culture that honors and glorifies God? John Piper, I remember once actually, not too long ago, actually said something pretty amazing to me. He says, he used to always say all the Christians need to be, evangelizing and discipling and not out there writing books and making movies. That's, all right, but, okay, you can have a job, but just tithe. The rest of us are really doing the work of the kingdom. And till he began to realize, if there's no Christians writing books, making movies and television shows, after a while, people aren't even going to be able to understand me when I talk to them about the gospel, because they won't actually have the concepts. They won't have the furniture. The culture will be so apart that I'm going to have to give people a week of training just before they can even understand a gospel presentation. And therefore, what does within mean? It means that you have got to find ways of training your people to integrate their faith with their work, how to shape the way in which they work by their faith in the gospel. And that's going to be part of your discipleship program. There's got to be a way of discipling people to stay within the culture and not to withdraw from the culture and to come into your church. You've got to find ways of celebrating and lifting them up and making them sense that what they're doing is important, instead of making them feel like they're second-class citizens because they're not sold out for Jesus the way you are. So faithful presence within. Oh, faithful. What's faithful? Well, faithful is pretty important, and that is the danger of getting involved in cities and the danger of getting involved in cultural institutions is that you instead of you changing them, they change you. And when Jesus says you are salt of the earth, a salt that's lost its savor is useless. Well, what does that mean? It means, on the one hand, Christians are supposed to be out there in the world, and salt was what? Preservative, medicine in ancient times, and seasoning. That means that we're supposed to be out there serving people, changing people, being leaven and salt in the culture. But if you lose its savor, meaning if you really stop being salt, you're nothing but, I don't know what, sand, I guess. And the trouble with doing what I'm telling you is it's tough for people not to start to suck up to people, suck up to the culture, want to be accepted, and start to compromise biblically. Faithful presence within, faithful against the relevant to people who are afraid of looking different because you want to be updated. Present versus triumphalism and taking over, just present. Within, rather than purity from and staying away and saying, well, when we disciple you, we'll take you out. And I think that's the basic outline of the kind of stance toward culture, not triumphalism, not separatism. And I know it's pretty general, and you got 100 questions, so let's get to them.
10?
Where are we? Hi.
I wanted to ask a question in the last seminar.
That's fine, go ahead.
But it's actually come up again. It's
okay.
about this whole thing about being present in the city.
Yeah.
We find it's really difficult to keep families in the city. Because, like you said earlier, that there's a lot of single people.
I mentioned that, right.
Then they get married and then they go to the suburbs.
Yeah.
What do you do about this? Do you bang them over the head and make them stay? Or do you think it's relevant to have families in the city.
Yes, okay, it's not easy to keep people in the city without using guilt. It really isn't. What you need to do is you need to give them positive examples of people who've done it. So you need to go to some people who are committed to staying in the city and raising their family in the city. Now, we all know that people who make a lot of money can live here without a problem. But the average person who's not making a lot of money will find it very, very difficult. Actually, you want to know how bad it is? In Manhattan, it costs, these are things called dollars. Some of you might remember them, but they're coming up on you now. They used to be, some of you thought, oh, they're so far behind us that they're not even in a race, but they're coming up. But it costs $123,000 a year in Manhattan to purchase the same lifestyle as costs $50,000 in Houston. And actually even $62,000 in Philadelphia, which isn't very far away. So it's, and I'll bet you London's something like that too, way, way more expensive. So what does the average person do? The reason I say we can't use guilt is you can't. It just doesn't work. You can't say to people, don't leave, because then people sneak away. They won't even tell you they're leaving. It's terrible. They won't even tell you you're leaving because they're afraid. They don't want people to know. They suddenly just disappear, and they moved and they didn't tell you, and that's not right and sad. What you need, and besides that, it doesn't really work, actually. What you have to do is you have to find some people in the city who are committed to doing it, but they don't know how, and you work with them to try to be creative, and then you lift them up. And you have to be careful. You're not trying to do hero worship. But a good example, we had 4 families, I would say modest income, or some a little better than others. And they went in and bought what we would call a brownstone, which is a large townhouse for 4 families. And they found investors. That is, 2 of the families found parents who wanted to do a real estate investment. Do you remember when people used to want to do that? And so there was like 6 investors, and they bought the thing, and then they rehabbed it. They did their own sweat equity, we'd call it. And they're living there for much less than they could live rent-wise. But what they needed in that case was they needed some friends. They needed parents who bought in, and now it's a co-op. I don't know what you do. A co-op is a contract, and you own shares in the building, depending on how much money you put into it and how much work you put into it. And if you put in money and you put in work, every so often they change the contract to reflect what people are doing. When there was a single woman, was one of the 4 parties, and she moved to Washington, D.C., so the others, part of the deal was, if somebody has to move, the others have to buy the other person out, which means they have to raise capital, which in some cases mean they come up with it, or in some cases they have to get another investor who's not living there, or an investor who will. Now, is that complicated? Yeah. But you know what? They're still living there very, very nicely, in very nice space. And when you show people that, and there's a lot of other ways to do this, but when you show people some examples of folks who are doing it, and they're making pretty much the same amount of money that most other people are, people say, so it's really probably more a matter of effort and will than just money. In other words, if you have some ingenuity, if you can find some other folks to do it, you can stay too. Nevertheless, in the end, we found that the most important thing is just to stay put yourself. In other words, as a pastoral family, we just found if we stay put and we don't move, and we make friends, and people want to stay in the city because they have such good friends. And so the way to it's got to you can't use guilt. You have to attract people, and one is by just loving people, and they don't want to lose the fellowship they've got. See, if you're just a great Bible teaching church, but you're not an incredibly warm fellowship, you're not going to keep people in the city. You know what? It doesn't matter if the great preacher is there. They can get it online. They can get if it's just content, they can get it. What they can't get out there is community. So you have to create community that makes them want it, and then you have to show them some models of people who are doing it. Okay. Hi.
I don't know if there's... Oh, here we go. Tim, how do you help people integrate faith with their work at Redeemer? Could you give us some practical examples, please?
I will give you 3 examples,
Great.
but I don't want you to be discouraged by them because they took us 20 years to get to.
Go for it.
And we're big, okay? Now, some of you are, well, here's the other thing, is I believe that, none of your churches are as large as we are, and yet, if you pull your resources, and you're a tight, from what I can tell, you're, a tight-knit network compared to a very loose network, you could probably muster the things we're doing even now if you wanted to. But here's the three things. We basically think that to help people integrate faith and work, people need three things. They need a lot of support. That is, they need emotional and spiritual support for being in their job. They need someone who understands what it's like to be in the job they're in. One of the problems with us pastors is, if I was never in your field, in fact, in some of our cases, we've been in the ministry so long, we kind of forget what it's like to be out there. And we're not very, there needs to be some way in which they get that kind of emotional, spiritual support for the particular temptations and strains and stresses of being in that job, number one. Number two, they need education. They actually need someone to teach, how do you bring Christianity to bear on your field? How should it affect the way in which you work? What are the reigning idols of your field, and how can you, in other words, what's wrong with your field, and how could you be a Christian influence in your field, and so on. The third is to give them practical help to do their job better, to actually make it easier for the open doors so people can do their job better. So one's theoretical, one is more emotional and spiritual, and one is more practical. Now, here's what we've done in every one of those three areas. Under the more emotional or the spiritual, we have vocational fellowships, which means we get people together in their vocation, and we really encourage them to develop relationships and find ways of encouraging each other. This can be anything from, like, for example, we have, I think it's 12 to 15. And some may be defunct and may get up. It depends on the lay leadership, but it means we will get musicians together. We will get artists, visual artists together. We'll get financial people together, business leaders together, marketing and promotion and advertising people together. I mean, we even have a composers fellowship. We're just the people who are just doing composing. We have like 30 or 40. That's the advantage of being a big church. And again, though, in your networks, you might be able to do this sort of thing. And those vocational fellowships, there's no rhyme or reason to how they do. Sometimes they may have 2 or 3 meetings a year and bring in a speaker. Sometimes they have a monthly meeting. Sometimes they have both, and the people who come to the monthly meeting might be 20 or 30, and when they have a big meeting, they get 100. That's vocational fellowships. When it comes to the education input, we're pioneering a couple of things. One of them is called Gotham Fellows, and Gotham Fellows is a post-university 1-year boot camp for thinking out what it means to be a Christian in your field. You get a lot of reading, a lot of theological study. You get a mentor in your field. So if you're a dancer, you get a Christian dancer. If you're a lawyer, you get a Christian law partner. If you're a financial person, you get a Christian person in the financial world. And we're still pioneering that, and we have to not only develop one for it's easier for post-university people because most of them are single. They have a little more bandwidth as it is, as it were. We need to find ways of giving the same input to people in the middle of their career. The third thing, this is going to, some of you are going to say, what? We have what we call an entrepreneurship forum. And a couple of people put money into a pot, and then there's a committee that decides, that runs a business plan competition and gives away grants to help 3 people every year get started in business. One is a for-profit, one is a non-profit that helps the poor, and one is an arts initiative. And the business plan has to show that you really are bringing the gospel to bear on your way of thinking, that you understand that this is not just here to make money, but it's also here to support human flourishing, and the gospel comes to bear on the business plan. And we've done this for about 4 years, and every year you're actually giving people $20,000 to $50,000 a piece, I think, or something like that. I'm not sure about my numbers, but to get going in a small business. And I know that's a lot of people say, "Wow." Well, and it's just the start. But that's the practical. The Gotham Fellows is an example of the educational, and the vocational fellowships are the existential, spiritual, personal. Okay. Here comes the mic.
Hi, Tim.
Hi.
Regarding the defense against, which is talking about people in politics, in government.
Right.
I'm sure you're not against Christians being in politics or in government.
Not at all.
But how would you advise Christians who are actively in politics to influence decisions without necessarily imposing biblical ideas on others?
Yeah. I think the main thing about defensive against is I think the defensive against, I'm not answering your question directly yet, but I promise to get there. The defensive against mindset thinks that politics leads, that culture flows from politics. And what I'm trying to say is that politics is downstream from cultural change. And therefore, it puts, I think a Christian in politics needs to know his or her place. That your job is there to represent Christ and to serve your constituents and to here and there do what you can to stem what you think would be a tide against Christian values, but knows that the way to change culture is not through politics. Let me give you a quick example, and that is, okay, in America anyway, again, sorry I have to use American as an illustration. Right now there's a fair number of laws against sexual harassment, which are mainly there to protect women in the workplace, right? Do you have laws like that? Okay. Well, imagine in 1905, some MP trying to introduce a bill in Parliament, against, making sexual harassment an offense. Can you imagine? Everybody would say, "What are you talking about? There's nothing wrong with." The point is, culture had to change, and then politics. After the culture changed, politics came along and kept the culture going in that direction. But it's downstream of the change. Now, what happens? Where does the change come from? The change comes from, I think, deeper places, which actually has to do with writing and the academy and the intellectual stuff, the philosophy. It also comes from the art world. It comes from the popular. It comes from film. It comes from a lot of different things, including, by the way, the decline of the churches. When the churches were 60% of the population, coming to church and hearing, sermons, it's one thing, and when the church is 5% of the population. So all kinds of things led to the change of the culture, and politics was downstream. And so as long as you're in politics and you understand, your job is not so much to take over, but to serve and to do your best to perhaps retard certain cultural trends and encourage other cultural trends. As long as you see yourself in that sort of auxiliary role, fine. That's not how a lot of people in that camp think of it. They really do see it. This is our way of essentially taking over. There's something, when the liberal secular people are afraid of some evangelical Christians, they're probably right, for some of them. But again, I don't think that's so much an issue here. But anyway, that's what I meant by defense. I certainly am not against Christians in politics. In fact, my word, it would be wonderful. The more you can get Christians in politics, the better. But in there, as servants, I think they would win influence by first serving. They would get power if people don't see them as trying to work for their Christian tribe's values. They're just going to be turned out. If you're a politician, you're supposed to be serving your constituents. And so if you really, really serve, then you eventually will get power. So I think it works across the board, the principles, okay? I don't know where the mics are. There's so many of you I can't see.
Hi.
Where are we?
Kind of back right.
Oh, hi there. Okay.
I was just wondering, could you comment on some of the distinctives of city churches you've come across, whether they're in your network or others, that some of the distinctives that bind them together? Because obviously I've been to your church, I've been to lots of churches which are in cities and seen how widely different they are. I just wondered if you could comment on some of the things that you see that churches that are doing well have found and are doing that we can imitate and learn from.
Yeah, well, this may be an exaggeration, but I'm not, I think, this is just my anecdotal, I only have anecdotal evidence for this, But I think John Stott may have pioneered modern center city ministry. Because what John Stott did was he combined things that most churches don't combine. So on the one hand, you had strong expository preaching, theological depth. Because actually, center city people are fairly literate, and they value good communication. They value a sermon that's well prepared, that's been researched, that they see the person. In the city, a lot of people work very hard at their job, and they probably want to see that you, the minister, work pretty hard at your job, that you didn't just throw things together and are just talking off the cuff. My friend David Midwood, who's here, has this great story about the man who got up in the pulpit and said, "Oh Lord, before I begin my sermon, anoint my lips, give me the words to say, show me what I should be saying to these people." And suddenly out of the heavens comes this voice, "Oh, you mean you're not prepared?" So I think that it's actually pretty important. I think John Stott was pretty important. He showed that folks really want to see that you have done your homework, you've really thought about it, you're reading the books that they're reading in their culture, you know what their situations are, you're out there talking with them, and so that when you bring the word to bear, you're bringing the word to bear on them. That's one. Number two, along with that, a pretty big a lot of emphasis on evangelism, because it's a city. A lot of ministry, evangelism to university students, evangelism to businessmen and women, evangelism. Thirdly, with that went an emphasis on the arts. There are a lot of people in the city who are writers and who are actors and who are visual artists and musicians. They're very thick on the ground in a city. And one of the things that we discovered, I think they did that there too, is a lot of folks who aren't really artists by profession like to, use their musical talent in the church. And in cities, it was actually important to show artists who have dedicated their whole lives to it that we really take them seriously and we really want to hear from them. And so over the years, occasionally I've found that when a person who's a Christian longer and been with me longer, and they want to use their musical gifts, and I've got people out there who actually are way more gifted, maybe a little newer in the faith, and they're part of the artistic community, and if I've given them, if I've invited them to share, sometimes the Christian who actually that's not their calling, that's not their vocation or profession, is offended or upset. And I'm listen, the artists are not, most other places, artists are hired help, hired hands, hired hitman, Here, they're a constituency. I mean, they're a big part of the population. And you really need to make sure that you are an arts-friendly church. And I think John Stott did some of that. Then lastly, you talk about integration of faith and work, because people live in their jobs here in a way they don't outside. Many people come here to be in their profession, and they're more dominated by their profession, and the work is longer. And so they live in their jobs. And so if your church doesn't in any way address them in their jobs, then it's almost like you can't disciple them, because 80% of their life is in their jobs. So the emphasis on faith and work, the caring for the poor and the needy in the city, evangelism, really well worked out teaching, and being arts friendly. You put all that together, that's usually a successful center city church. And most churches don't combine all those things. And I learned that from John Stott, actually, many, many years ago. And most of the center city churches that thrive in America, in the center of Boston or New York or Philadelphia, have actually worked off of his model for quite a number of years. Somebody else? Hi.
Hi.
Sorry.
I wanted to know if you had any insights into student work specifically, because cities have universities and a huge student population normally, and that's also obviously a huge place for culture to grow, because those students are shaped in those years. So
I may not be giving you much in the way of insights, except maybe I hope you want me to do this. I want to cheer for student ministry, especially in cities. Here's why. ministry to a student in a big university in a small town, that's extremely important, but almost all those kids are going to, when they graduate, they're going to leave because that's not a place where people settle down. There's no jobs. It's a university setting. When you come to a place like London and you reach out to students, the chances of the students that you reach staying in your church and staying in the city are really good. In fact, it's easier, I found, if you win somebody to Christ as a university student in a city, it's easier to get them to live there long term. Because they're younger, they're wet cement, they don't have a family, they're not thinking about bills and things like that yet. And they're able to live pretty cheaply, to stay long term. And after a while they get so acclimated, they really become urban in their sensibility, and they learn how to live here and how to get things done. So if you reach out to students and you regularly win students to Christ in the city, you're creating your own future leadership pipeline in a way that doesn't happen elsewhere. Please don't think I'm saying, working with universities in small towns is no good. I'm just saying, in cities, university ministry is extremely important for growing your future leadership. And that's why I mentioned that actually, I mentioned that briefly when I talked about what a center city ministry is. Bible exposition, arts, faith work, caring for the poor, evangelism, but especially university. In fact, our denomination, because it has a very strong university ministry called RUF, Reformed University Fellowship. RUF not only wins people to Christ to come into the churches, but RUF campus ministers who are both campus staff, both men and women, lots of people after they graduate become Christians, then they go into student ministry as student ministers, staff. And it's a tremendous training ground for future church leaders. And so we've found in our denomination that we have this constant pipeline of great young men and women coming up who are able to do all sorts of full-time ministry because they come out of the campus work. So not only does it help you directly in your church if you win students in big cities, especially because they'll stay in the city, they can, but as a network, if you had a lot of student ministries, you'd be amazed at the kind of pipeline that is for future ministers. So it's really important. Why aren't you on?
I'm on.
You're on.
Yeah.
And
Am I on?
You know
Yes,
what?
I am. Oh,
You
sorry,
are.
we're both
I
on.
I believe that mathematically you are the center of the entire.
Well, thank you.
I believe that geometrically and mathematically you are the center. So it's only appropriate that you would have the final question.
You mentioned that the wrong way that the church should relate to the culture is just being relevant to. However, you said in your first sermon about contextualization, and you're
Yes.
big on that. Do you want to explain how you relate those two together?
Are you suggesting an inconsistency? Actually, honestly, all three of those, the defensive against, the purity from, and the relevant to, are all right, partly. So you shouldn't just go after me about relevant to. Relevant to means we care about the culture, we have to contextualize. Defensive against means there's poison in this culture and we've got to be faithful. See? And purity from actually does mean be careful that the church doesn't get co-opted and become part of the world, because the church's job is to preach the gospel. It's not to make films. It's not, you disciple people to make films. It's not to engage in politics. You disciple people to engage in politics. So they're all right, but they're all reductionistic. That is to say, they take one part of the faithful presence within. They take one part of what I consider a balanced cultural stance, and they lift it up over the others, and they're simply unbalanced. And obviously, let me say this about being culturally relevant. If I am trying to adapt the gospel to reach a new generation or a new culture, if I over-adapt so that I'm compromising the truth and I'm afraid of offending people with the gospel, then I've actually bought into the idols of the new culture. But if I under-adapt, then I bought into the idols of my culture. And I'm offensive not just with the gospel, but with my own, cultural baggage. Actually, let me say one other thing about this, but I bet you all know this. Americans are a little less class conscious. Americans and Australians and Canadians are a little less class conscious. And when we come to Britain, we notice, and we never know quite what to say, but there just seems to be a lot more pride in where you're from, more pride in the South versus, prejudice against people from the north of England, prejudice against people who didn't go to public schools, prejudice against, people who went to this school versus that school. It's probably because you're older, because it's Europe, and it's sort of the residue. And we're all a bunch of, what somebody said is, if you're in Europe, you had 8 children, and the one with ants in his pants, the one that didn't get along, and the one that didn't like hierarchical structure and didn't like Europe, went off to America, or Australia, or Canada, and then they married somebody else who also went because they couldn't get, and so we're just, we're innovators, and we don't like institutions, and we don't like tradition, okay, and we have all that. And so we have our own problems. I don't want you to think we do. But when I come here, I see this sort of class. All of us non-Brits who are English speakers come, and we see much more class consciousness and pride. And therefore, frankly, white people, I think, are more unconscious of their prejudices. And I think upper crust people are more unconscious of their prejudices. And it comes out in the preaching and in the teaching. And a lot of the way in which things are done are very off-putting to people who aren't white, or people who aren't, didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge, or didn't, and the people who are inside don't see it. They wonder what the problem is, and they wonder why they're not reaching out better. So I don't want to when I say relevant to was a wrong, you're absolutely right in saying contextualization is very important, listening and adapting to other culture is very important, and you can't get away from the danger of over-adapting by under-adapting, because you can lose the gospel every bit as much. Nevertheless, all of them are right, partly. The real problem is that defensive against is right, purity from, they're right, but they're unbalanced, that's all. And I think I need to say adieu to you, okay? Thanks.